You lot seem to have really enjoyed my initial dive into racing content in non-racing games. So much so that a lot of the comments in that video were mentioning games that I haven't included in the original video, so I decided to do a follow-up video on this topic, showcasing even more racing in non-racing games. Where else to start but this unique piece of history? Being the earliest timeline-wise, the Saboteur is a game released in 2009 by Pandemic Studios and published by none other than EA, following the story of Sean Devlin, a British mechanic
I'm fucking Irish.
and a member of the French resistance during the German occupation around the start of World War II, featuring some well-known and popular mechanics at the time with its third-person run-and-gun action, Assassin's Creed-inspired traversal, but most importantly for our case, the racing action with these classical 20th century cars. So as much as I'd like to indulge in this game's unique usage of colors as a gameplay mechanic, what about its driving mechanics? Well, to accommodate the constant need of driving all around the map, cars in this game drive well enough with the good old arcade handling. Everything accelerates fast enough, at least for the time period, and they turn pretty quickly as well. Comes in handy for most of the game's driving missions, but for the racing content, it kinda makes things too easy. Despite the period this game takes place in, the damage system is a lot more lenient. Understandable since they need strong cars to deal with the German panzers. So aside from the circuit race, the game also provides some variety with a time trial, rally races, and some main story related racing activities. We got some flexibility with whatever car to bring for the side activity races, but this is where the collection system comes into play. As the name suggests, it's a mechanic available in this game for players to store any car they find in the world. To make it extra convenient, there is an indicator showing if a car has already been collected or not when approaching them. Although certain cars are only unlocked via missions and achievements, including some cool looking race variants of other cars among the collection. But overall, there's only 3 racing side activities, and they're not replayable. Even unlocking them requires a lot of progression, as the third race is available right before the final story mission is unlocked. So despite being a pretty good game with a unique take on the topic of World War II, the racing content is a bit lacking and way too underutilized. It overall ends up undermining the car collection feature, with the potential of being used for a lot more content, which could have been fixed slightly if they had added a way to replay finished races. Most likely one of the biggest damages the game received after it was rushed by EA to be released in its current incomplete state. Moving a bit further into the timeline, I've covered Mafia 1, which had a single mission regarding racing. It was intense for a good reason, but was ultimately a simple one-time distraction from its gameplay loop. Mafia 2 would unfortunately follow suit with only one mission, a highway race, a part of Joey's adventures where you race through 10 checkpoints around Empire Bay. But what about Mafia 3? Well, they actually added more racing content for players to indulge in, taking place in the year of 1968, right at the peak years of muscle cars. As a result, there are a lot of powerful American stallions at our disposal, each with its own stats to accommodate different situations. Unfortunately, only 2 classes are usable for these races within the sports and exotic classifications. The game's handling is certainly interesting. It's a bit of a departure from its predecessor and overall falls under the understeery side of things, but I suppose it makes sense with these being muscle cars. Sim mode may be able to help in this situation. At least from what I've experienced, it seems to reduce the counter steer assist. Sadly, the vehicle damage model in this game is quite lackluster. At best, it's around the same level as what a damage model would look like in some of the modern Forza titles, but even then, the performance penalty is not as impactful either. While most of the races are the usual checkpoint-based races with arguably weak AI, the way it's set up makes up for it. Each race normally has 4 different rewards depending on the placement. Usually third and second reward will be simple cold hard cash, but then there's first place and another extra if we can get first while breaking the time record, rewarding players with upgrade parts. From the simple decorations such as decals, window tints and rims, to several supercharger kits, exhausts, and many other items. Some may increase the actual performance of the car, but others are there to give you that sweet placebo effect. The feature gives a lot of interesting options, mostly those that will satisfy fans of pure old American muscle cars, but since every vehicle shares the same customization options, it might end up making things feel samey. The tracks themselves will take players around the city roads of New Bordeaux up to the wild and wet bayou over at the outskirts, providing enough challenges for players to roll in, whether it be on and off track with a number of sick jumps scattered throughout the map. In the case of getting turtled, you'd have to wait until the car itself stops and flips itself upright. There's no reset button, but at least it doesn't instantly destroy the car in the process. Beating all these races will unlock a special car, so there's worth in clearing these activities. The best part, they are replayable, so all of the cars, upgrades, and unlockables can be utilized for these racing side activities in the end. Overall, I think they did a pretty good job implementing racing into Mafia Mafia 3, with the big positive of having time records to beat as an additional goal, giving players incentives to actually get good with the driving mechanic, and it's not just a time trial race scattered throughout the map. Welcome to the 80s, the holy grail of pop culture content. But flip that grail around and we get to see the more seedy underbelly of the 80s, under the neon lights and drug trafficking. One piece of media depicting this would be none other than Scarface, a movie starring Al Pacino as the iconic Tony Montana.
Say hello to my little friend!
The man who would become the inspiration for GTA Vice City, released in the year 2006 for the PS2, original Xbox, and Windows PC by Radical Entertainment and Vivendi Games. The title puts players into the shoes of Tony Montana in a what-if sequel scenario, where Tony has to rebuild his drug empire and reclaim the land once more against the different enemy gangs, and as a crime boss, he's got to show to the world that he's also the fastest in Florida. One of these methods includes racing, and unfortunately, it's strictly time trial based. The only positive here is the game allowing players to bring any ride into these activities, and the challenge comes from weaving through traffic and the narrow pathways. Damage model, while at least visually better than Mafia 3, is not much of an improvement but is entirely in line with games from the mid-2000s. It is just okay. The racing seems like an afterthought for the sake of padding out content rather than one that's made to be engaging and interesting, which is kind of a shame. The game had quite a unique selection of cars to choose from, but sadly there's no AI opponents to challenge, and is ultimately something most people will do to get the 100% completion reward. Within the same time frame over on the eastern side, a title developed and released in the year 1999 by Sega's AM2 development team under the leadership of Yu Suzuki, a game which would become known as a cult masterpiece and the blueprint to what would later become the Yakuza Like a Dragon franchise, becoming one of the earliest games to try and create a realistic environment with brawler mechanics to fit the martial arts aesthetic, and arguably one of the earliest games to span the ever-living shit out of QuickTime events.
Yo, what's up?
Sorry, are you okay?
I'm sorry.
I'm okay, but Kayoko.
And it's also known for its great dialogue.
Years ago, I was Chinese.
With the amount of content it had to offer back then, providing a plethora of variety while following the journey of Ryo Hazuki to find his father's murderer. In the process, Ryo and the player learn more of the environment, neighborhood, the citizens, and gain a lot of life experience from the mundane tasks masked as minigames. Among the many experiences Ryo would have is the ability to be forklift certified. But first, we need the job position within the harbor area, which is going to take quite a bit due to the game's lack of UI, specifically designed to make players interact with NPCs as we see and experience the game as if we are Ryo himself, while also investigating a motorcycle gang roaming around town known as the Mad Angels. While this interaction is considered a race, the Mad Angel sequence pretty much falls into the usual QTE mechanics, with the race behaving like a simple straight line drag race with some tomfoolery involved. The day after, however, is when the action truly begins. During the morning routine, every worker in the harbor, or specifically the forklift operators, gather around to do a simple 3-lap race around the harbor exclusively using their forklifts. The challenge comes down to the forklift handling and weaving through the many hazards scattered around the harbor map, as a lot of details around the map could easily be an obstacle stopping players on the spot. Plus, the AI themselves can be challenging with how well they corner around the narrow paths. There is no requirement to finish first, but depending on where Ryo finishes, there would be different responses and rewards after the finish line is crossed. This is primarily due to the racing bit being designed to get players up to speed with how the forklift controls, as what follows after is a mundane crate moving daytime job. With a couple more forklift races, this is generally what's available here. It's certainly an interesting idea for a racing minigame. There's no customization, which makes it internally consistent with the rest of the game, with the goal of going after realism in most aspects, making this one of the simplest racing content in the collection. By now you've probably heard of the name True Crime due to its relevancy as a genre, but in the past it was also known as one of the first GTA clones at the time, released in the year of 2003 by Luxoflux and Activision. Before we start though, I should mention this is the PS2 version of the game, so several emulation janks might pop up here and there. The game follows the story of Nicholas Kang, an LAPD detective with as much wit as the bullets in his pockets.
I told you my kung fu is better, didn't I?
Featuring unique elements of a good cop, bad cop, depending on your actions as Nick. The capability to continue the story despite failing consistently, resulting in different endings. But for this one, we're gonna have to be the bad cop, speeding through the streets of LA with a couple of select sedans, sports, and tuner cars to borrow from your fellow citizens. Although you can't just borrow any impounded car from the lot. Unfortunately, the way saved vehicles work here is dependent on the last car the player drove before any transition. So there's no optimal way to get fast cars other than relying on traffic RNG. Although to get to the racing content, we're gonna need to kick some ass in between. Several main missions do feature racing, but they mostly fall under the point-to-point time trials, with most of the bulk of driving's purpose to take Nick from one crime scene to the next. And one actual racing mission against Lola, in a 5-lap circuit race around a parking lot with explosive barrels. Handling is quite grippy, with almost every car having moderate acceleration. Top speed, on the other hand, quite questionable, but the damage model is pretty top-notch, if not a bit exaggerated with how much bullets can do to them.
Hands up.
But no worries, just drive up to a gas station and they'll fix it up. Aside from having to drive from between crime scenes, there's not really that much racing to be had here. Just a single race with Lola and a bunch of time trial based missions. But then there's its sequel. 2 years later, we went from the West Coast to the East Coast with true crime streets of New York, toning down the comedic tone for a more straight-faced attitude. Just like before, I gotta mention, this is the PS2 version running on an emulator, so there might be some graphical jank here and there. As the name suggests, the game takes place in New York with its semi-permanent drab weather, high-rise buildings lined up next to many streets and heavy traffic. So while the game keeps most of the same loop as LA, the amount of changes here opens up avenues of challenging drives thanks to a higher traffic density and the amount of one-way only roads. While vehicle variety has received significant increase with more motorbikes, muscle, and supercars littering the streets of New York, the game has a knack to keep spawning Crown Vics. Fortunately, there is a way better method to spawn in vehicles from the police station, although the change in handling is quite questionable. With cars constantly losing a lot of speed from simple turns, the racing content is available quite early for this one with a total of 13 races, all of them being the basic checkpoint-based circuit and point-to-point race, with usually 3 or more opponents on the road. Story-wise, main protagonist Marcus Reed is doing all this specifically to go undercover and apprehend the ringleader of this illegal street racing group. Despite this, it's not all good. AI are tough at the start, but they constantly crash to pretty much anything in their vicinity, and once you pass them, there's not really that much challenge due to completely screwed up pathing. They even get stuck behind a wall somehow, which might be an emulation jank except for the fact that this also happened to me in the PC version, causing what is probably one of the most chaotic races with the janky pathing and rubber band going from 0 to 300 in a heartbeat. Getting first place quadruples the amount of cash spent on entry, which means there are things to purchase with repair costs, paints, and vehicle upgrades despite how rare it is for vehicles to have the option. Dealerships also exist, but yeah, earnings from racing alone won't be able to cover these prices. And what do we get for finishing all the racing content here?
You have my respect. I'm gonna take this on the road, and I need someone to help me run this racing enterprise. Make some real money. Come on, Papi. What do you say?
No.
Hijo de mierda, te voy a chingar, puto!
Blocking out any chance to ever replay the races completely. While there is more racing content in this game over its predecessor, it also falls quite flat thanks to the uninspired race layouts, some extremely janky AI, and bizarre design choices for the handling. With that, let's take a break from all this realism and experience something out of the box for once. A popular demand from the previous video, it's none other than Minecraft boat racing. You heard that right, Minecraft boat racing, because unsurprisingly the boat physics of Minecraft can be quite a fun thing to play around with and most surprisingly used for racing. How, you may ask? Well, originally born from a bug turned into an intended feature, with boats receiving extra speed from ice surfaces, mixing the fact that boats in a regular Minecraft session have similar physics to a drift car, and from there just put 2 and 2 together. While not exactly its own game mode within Minecraft's survival and creative modes, I decided to include this due to its unique circumstances and amazing achievements. Long story short, it led to the development of a community surrounding the idea of boat racing in Minecraft, just from the simple appeal of having fun with boat physics eventually becoming this big passion and going further into some pretty serious competition. You can't play it without mods, but if you want a better experience, you can check the description to a mod pack that I linked. It's similar to Assetto Corsa modding. Built by dedicated community members, these guys even got their own special hub, MMO-style tutorial quests to help new players adapt to this new environment, and more tracks are currently still being built on top of the hundreds of tracks available at the moment. From custom-made track layouts, recreation of Toge tracks like Mount Akina, Akagi, the C1 loop from the Wangan Midnight, and any other Japanese highway racing game, Mario Kart tracks, rally tracks, every single F1 track under the sun, with a lot of ingenious designs put behind these recreation of maps to make verticality work as a factor with these boats, a pit stop minigame, time leaderboards for the competitive side of these communities, to the point of having qualifications and actual race events for current active participants, achieving the peak of boat racing with understanding of the terrain and throttle control, somehow creating a more tense racing atmosphere than the current F1 season. For vehicle customization, you can choose different type of wood for your boat, but for more options, you'd want to have mods for changing the appearance of these boats. Want a JDM machine? Sure. European vehicles? Go right ahead. There's no such thing as stat differences, so it all ultimately comes down to personal skill. If you're interested in joining this cool community, you can check out the link in the description for both the server and mod pack guide to install. Special thanks to Adam's Apples for introducing me to the scene and for the help with this part of the video. I really appreciate it, and you guys can go check out his and many other of the community members' channels for more Minecraft boat racing. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of people at least have heard of or seen a bit of Mortal Kombat in their life, a fighting game known for its brutal fatalities,
Massive budget.
but surprisingly, even this type of game has racing content, and it can be found in Mortal Kombat Armageddon made by Midway. And yes, this is Mario Kart again. We get to pick between a selection of combatants, each having their own cards and power-ups. Unfortunately, this does mean there is a meta character with the most useful power-up, which may cause fatalities towards friendships, because this game mode also features 2-player split-screen multiplayer. But regardless, you have 5 stages to select from, each having their own layout, hazards, and shortcuts. It'll take some time to master the mode of combat, especially with the shortcuts activating hazards to punt opponents, assuming it's possible because this system is very awkward to use. And what do you get for winning all these 5 stages? Overall, just a fun time. Extra if you got a buddy to play the game with. So yeah, there's not much about this, but honestly, it's a fun and well enough distraction for anyone getting frustrated with the main gameplay. Well, if Mortal Kombat racing is not weird enough for you, I got yet another bizarre entry in this list.
Oh man, don't tell me I've been slaying hot girls this whole time.
A game where you play as Jack Black rocking around the world on the Dukes. Released in the year of 2009 by Double Fine and EA, the game has you travel around the world inspired by all kinds of heavy metal, delivering salvation to the oppressed humanity with his mighty guitar axe combo. While the game contains very simplistic combat sequences, it's the way things are surrounded by the utilization of heavy metal that makes it quite the experience. For example, summoning the Deuce requires a few notes to be hit with your guitar. A lot of the time, you'll be sitting down inside the Deuce for the game's vehicle combat sections and map explorations, but for the racing content, we'll have to look for Fleetus, a demon hailing from the Motor Freaks faction.
Lucky break, human.
He'll provide both the activity and challenges of the racing content. 5 races are available in total, and the biggest obstacle will come down to the terrain. Throughout the world, roads are present, but most of these races will outright ignore them, making players contend with the bumpy off-road terrains, presenting the challenge as when to unleash the nitro. Speaking of which, what kind of secret juice can we extract from the Deuce? At its most basic, we have of course an arcadey handling, a very effective handbrake, and nitro. Every bit of these mechanics will also come in handy for not only racing, but also the vehicle combat sections this game has to offer. And the Deuce also has other upgrades from weapons with missiles, machine guns, mines, flamethrowers, and lethal subwoofers. Also the basic upgrades with armor, performance upgrades, paint jobs, and who else to provide these upgrades other than Ozzy Osbourne himself.
Well, it's about fucking time!
But regardless, this is pretty much it for the racing content in this one. A heavy metal inspired game having this much driving is certainly interesting and surprising. I would recommend this game just out of how generally entertaining it is with Jack Black's performance and the humorous writing. LEGO City Undercover is one of the biggest LEGO titles to come out in the early 2010s, with its open world, magnificent scale, and plethora of content. Originally released for the Wii U, the game would also see a port for the Switch, PS4, and PC, allowing more players to enjoy this piece of entertainment, and most importantly, making my job easier for this video. The game follows the story of Chase McCain, a veteran police officer returning to the site of LEGO City after some time away, and his nemesis Rex Fury has escaped custody alongside a band of clown criminals. Throughout the campaign, McCain would be given access to several police equipment, which also includes the police vehicles. But of course, being an open world game, he is capable of commandeering civilian cars on the streets or simply calling in vehicles via specific call-in points. With a total of 120 unlockable vehicles to discover, the game feeds into the usual completionist mindset just like most LEGO games do, separated into all of these classes, each having their own gimmicks and abilities such as nitro and jumping. Mechanics that will come in useful for the main missions, but most importantly, the racing content, which requires a lot of undercover action first, with the earliest content being available in Chapter 6. Most of them are time trials mixed in with the super build feature. A super build is a general mechanic allowing players to build certain facilities throughout the map, vehicle drop stations being the earliest, and more importantly for these minigames, ramps. Although the game is quite lenient with its time constraint, even missing a checkpoint for over 5 seconds can still result in a victory, and the races themselves will take place in almost every terrain possible. A total of 16 races utilizing every possible vehicle the game has to offer, from motorbikes, cars, and boats. Certain races also reward us with vehicles for use in both races and missions, some of which will come in handy for the game's ultimate completionist. So while the game doesn't really provide enough of a variety with its racing content, it does deserve a bit of praise for mixing up the basic time trial with the game's unique super build feature throughout its open world section. Even more so because of its well-written humorous storytelling, this game is almost to that point of being as good as Simpsons Hit and Run in a general sense.
First, you have to prove yourself. Here is a list of instructions. Follow them, and then report to my salvage yard.
And don't get caught like those knuckleheads did!
Sure thing, Mr. Chan.
Please, call me sir.
Why are you still here?
But what if they become a bit more experimental? LEGO as video games have been around for over 2 decades. Throughout that process, they've taken in a number of franchises to absorb and utilize these video games. The first Marvel Superheroes LEGO title was released back in 2013, with the map of Manhattan, New York as the game's open world section. Bringing the unique cast of Marvel comics into the mix would prove to be beneficial, as the opportunity to utilize the characters' superpowers to the benefit of variety gameplay. Although the formula of making checkpoint-based time trials hasn't changed much, the developers took full advantage by adding even more vehicle races, several races based on characters with abilities. There's always an icon to indicate what kind of vehicle or character will be needed for the race specifically, and each one rewards the players with a gold brick. Overall, it's a slight improvement over Undercover City. A bit more improvements would come in its sequel 4 years later by adding more character classifications for different types of activities and a more varied map. But there wouldn't be much else in terms of the racing content, still just the time trials with the new map of Chronopolis, utilizing every single unique bit from each part of the Marvel universe, giving a lot of colors and terrain variety to the scene. And finally, a year later with the parent company Warner Bros. At the helm, it wouldn't be far-fetched for them to take in, let's say, the DC Comics superheroes, or to be specific, supervillains, released back in 2018. And unfortunately, the races are still the similar time trials, just in a new map, with different vehicles, changing up the rewards, and different characters. This is pretty much what racing content falls into within these LEGO titles. It's kind of a shame since there should be a bit more usage of the IP for the gameplay, such as having to race against the Flash as another speedster, or racing against Superman for its flight-based racing, but it is what it is. The LEGO team would bring back a classic from the 2000s with the Star Wars Skywalker saga. With it, the cult classic pod racing section from Star Wars Episode 1. A single race that functions closely to the races of Wipeout, Redout, and every single anti-gravity racer made over the years. The big challenge comes from having to deal with the pod racer handling while dodging the environmental hazards, aiming for the boost pads and the new addition of QTEs every now and then. It's unique enough and manages to differentiate itself from the original rendition of the pod race in the original LEGO Star Wars The Complete Saga, but not exactly for good reasons only. The QT mentioned before made it very obvious how scripted parts of the races are, and it gets more obvious when players can notice the AI behavior, with them passing only in specific sectors of the track before completely falling off. Not to say players can't fail, that's still a possibility, just that they made it a lot unlikely. It's still a fun experience and distraction from the rest of the game's more combat and puzzle style gameplay, with some funny bits of writing here and there. Before there was Mad Max 2015, ID Software and Bethesda had already made their own piece of post-apocalyptic motorsport, simply inspired by the original Mad Max movies, released in the year of 2011 for the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC. The story follows Nicholas Rain, a soldier put into hibernation and woken up a century into the future, having to fight his way against the current government called the Authority. And what better way than to utilize one of the game's central mechanics of vehicle combat, featuring several racing game modes akin to the Mario Kart series, with power-ups all over the tracks, Twisted Metal's more combat-oriented arena with different variations of weaponry rules, or something more vanilla with time trials and regular circuit races. Subsequently, because Rage is an RPG experience, it's generally competently made, and somehow a lot better than Mad Max's death races. The AI is no slouch either, as they can consistently camp specific spots and will focus hard when they're loaded with rocket launchers. A good amount of variety from 27 races scattered throughout the map. 8 years later in the future, both Avalanche Studios and ID Software would team up to develop the sequel, Rage 2. With both having experience developing the first Rage title and Mad Max 2015, there's surely no way this would be worse. Well, unfortunately, Rage 2's racing side content has been drastically reduced into a single derby, with less variety than before, worse AI, and the rewards have gone to simply giving players cosmetic variants for the vehicles. Every now and then, some random dude may challenge the player to a race during exploration, but this is severely worse than the original title. Somehow, the combined might of two studios resulted in a product that's arguably worse when it comes to its content variety. Let's check back over in the East, with Square Enix and the spin-off prequel title Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep. Released in the year of 2010 for the PSP, following the events transpired before the main game's timeline, a trifold tragedy containing racing side content. Although a sizable chunk of progression is necessary to reach the area of Disney Town and its activity Racing Rumble, separated by 4 different tracks and their different challenges, from the layouts mixed with the game's bizarre handling model, character differences, the AI behavior, and learning the timing to use specific abilities. There are no pickups, so abilities are available by default with a cooldown after every use. The abilities players get will be the default shield, but for offensive options and handling, it will come down to the characters used. This is thanks to Birth by Sleep having 3 different characters. The unfortunate side is the fact that each character is separated by different campaign selection from the new game screen, meaning if players would like to switch to another character, they either must already have the designated character reach Disney Town or start a brand new campaign with said character. Nevertheless, these skills will come in clutch when the AI decides it's time for war or to avoid unnecessary skill issues with the track hazards. Which brings us the complexity of the stages. Country Chase being the easiest one has a wide road making it easier to avoid the hazards, and some of the more simple track decorations, ramp, and boost pad for an easy shortcut. The second round, Disney Drive, is an extended version of the Country Chase with even more sharp turns and narrow roads, ramping up the difficulty and becoming the filter for those who can stand the jank and those who cannot. Grand Prix, on the other hand, reverses the previous layout but also switches things up by moving hazards and decorations all around. And finally, Castle Circuits is straight up just sadistic. It straight up ditches the layout which had been used by all previous stages and makes up its own set of challenges, elongates it by 5 times, installed a bunch of time-based obstacles that will force racers into specific routes, makes the roads even tighter, and just for safety measures, a death pit. The reward for enduring this chaotic experience is pretty much the average items players can use for the game's main content. So at the very least, this game mode can serve as a both useful distraction and productive means for helping with the main progression. Would be great if it's a lot less janky though. The further I gather information and footage for this project, the more I find the bland and bad implementation of racing and non-racing titles, most being the generic time trial events made just to have racing for the sake of content variety. Not to say there's no good ones in the list. Shenmue's was a good example of well-placed execution for the sake of variety, placed in an area that makes sense within the game's plot and world building. It's even given me the chance to take a peek at a brilliant community that I never knew even existed, give me an excuse to try out the LEGO titles, and even Rage 1 surprised me with how well its racing content was done.